They say it takes 1 second to lose someone in, a lifetime to forget the silence they left behind. Aiden still remembered the last message he sent. It wasn't angry. It wasn't desperate. It was polite, measured, almost apologetic. Hey, just wondering if you're okay. If not, it's fine. Take care. Read. No reply. That was 3 months ago. What hurts the most isn't always the betrayal, the goodbye, or even the lies. It's the ghosting, the cold indifference, the silence that screams, you're not worth a response. But here's what they don't tell you. Silence only hurts when you still expect an echo. Aiden expected one. For weeks, he refreshed his messages like it was a ritual. He reread every word he'd sent, analyzing punctuation like it held the key to being loved again. And then, when the echo never came, he did what we're taught to do. He broke the silence first. He reached out again. Then again, he wrote a longer message, then a voice note, and finally, he apologized. Not for something he did, but for simply wanting to be seen. We're raised in a world that teaches us to prove ourselves, to chase validation, to speak up, speak louder, to never leave things unsaid. But what if the real power comes from what we choose not to say? Aiden had been conditioned to believe that silence meant failure, that not fighting for someone meant giving up, that not explaining his heart meant he didn't care enough. But none of that was true. Not then, and definitely not now. Because what Aiden didn't realize in that moment, when he sent that final message into the void, was that he was about to enter the most important phase of his life. Not because someone would come back, but because he would. Dad, see? There's a brutal truth no one tells you in your 20s. Most people are not rejecting you. They're avoiding their own discomfort. And the more you chase, the more you show them they can devalue you and still have access to your energy. That's the modern trap, believing love is earned through explanation, through endless emotional labor, through proving you're enough. But a Stoic knows better. A Stoic doesn't chase. A Stoic doesn't beg. A Stoic doesn't explain his worth to people who've already decided not to see it. A Stoic walks into silence and lets the silence speak for him. Aiden didn't know it yet, but the moment he stopped chasing, his real journey would begin, not toward getting someone back, but toward becoming someone he never thought he had the strength to be. You see, this isn't just Aiden's story, it's yours. It's every moment. You sat staring at your phone, wondering what you did wrong. It's every night you rehearsed the perfect message to win someone back. It's every second you sacrificed your dignity for the sake of closure. But this video isn't about pain, it's about power. Because the moment Aiden chose silence not out of bitterness, but out of clarity, his entire energy changed. He turned off his phone, he laced up his boots, he walked across the Manhattan Bridge into the kind of stillness that no one could interrupt. Not his past, not his pain, not even the people who once made him feel invisible. This is where it starts, not with a scream, not with revenge, but with a whisper inside you that says, I'm done begging to be seen. I see myself now. And once you do that, they'll feel your absence louder than they ever heard your voice. If that first moment just hit something deep inside you, if a part of you feels seen by this story, then don't scroll past. Subscribe to this channel right now so I can keep making more content that speaks to your strength, not your scars. And now, before we move forward on this journey of reclaiming your power, let's make this real for you. Here's a question just for you. When someone disrespects you or pulls away, what's your first instinct? A. Try to explain yourself, hoping they'll understand. B. Go silent, reflect, and protect your peace. Comment A or B below. Your answer might reveal more about your growth than you realize. Let's see how many warriors in this community are ready to step into the power of silence. Asterisk. When Aiden stopped reaching out, it wasn't dramatic. There was no grand announcement, no final message, no poetic goodbye. He simply stopped. 3 days had passed since the last unread message. A quiet, brutal realization had taken root inside him, one that didn't need confirmation to be real. She wasn't coming back, and she wasn't going to say it. And maybe that was the worst part. Not the loss, not the silence, but the fact that she didn't even think he deserved a goodbye. So Aiden made his own. He didn't slam any doors. He didn't unfriend, or block, or post cryptic quotes about self-worth. He just put his phone down, walked outside. The sun was low over the East River. Golden light spilled over the water, catching every ripple like a breath, trying to be heard. The city didn't slow down for his heartbreak, of course. Cars still honked. People still talked, too loudly into their phones. The world spun and moved by the ache inside him. But in that indifference, he found clarity. He sat on a bench near the water, breathing in the cold air, and for the first time in days, he didn't feel the urge to fix anything. He just let the absence settle. And that's when he realized something strange. Absence doesn't echo. It swells. It grows louder the longer you let it be. It expands in their mind, in their conscience, in their memory, until it becomes impossible to ignore. Aiden had spent so much time believing his silence was weakness, that not responding meant surrendering, that not chasing meant he didn't care. But the truth was the opposite. It wasn't weakness. It was restraint. It was self-respect, refusing to beg. He remembered what his therapist once told him. People hear silence differently than they hear words. Words can be argued with, but silence is a mirror. And that mirror had now been placed directly in front of her. Whether she wanted to look into it or not, Aiden would never know. That wasn't the point anymore, because the moment he stopped speaking, he began listening to himself. And something remarkable happened. On the 4th day, she liked an old photo on his feed. On the 5th, she viewed his story. On the 6th, a mutual friend said, "She asked about you," kind of casually. But Aiden didn't react. He didn't see it as a sign, didn't build a fantasy around it, because by then, he understood what was really happening. They weren't hearing his words anymore. They were feeling his absence. Not because he'd vanished, but because he'd stopped giving them the power to ignore him. You see, silence when used with intention isn't passive. It's an active reclaiming of your worth. It doesn't shout, "Look what you've lost." It whispers, "I'm no longer available for what hurts me." In San Francisco, a woman named Jenna had once shared her own ritual after being ghosted. Instead of texting him, she wrote a letter to herself, folded it neatly, placed it in a box labeled closure. Not closure, she begged for closure. She gave herself. That's what Aiden was doing now. And while there were still moments when his chest tightened with the memory of her voice, he didn't flinch anymore. He didn't reach. He didn't explain. He walked the length of the Brooklyn Bridge in the early morning fog. He walked the quiet aisles of the Strand bookstore, fingers trailing along the spines of books he used to recommend to her. He walked through the city as though it had always belonged to him, and now finally it did. Because it was his again, not theirs. Not a shared memory, not a place filled with what-ifs, but a place where he learned how to exist without performing for someone else's attention. And the irony, the moment he stopped performing, people noticed. That's the paradox. We spend so much time trying to be louder, clearer, more visible. But in the end, it's our silence that leaves the deepest impression. Because silence holds something words can't. The power to make someone sit with their own actions, without giving them an escape route through conversation. Aiden didn't go quiet because he wanted her to chase him. He went quiet because he finally stopped chasing himself. That's what absence really is. It's not a tactic. It's a turning point. A decision to let the echo speak in your place. Not because you're bitter, but because you're done explaining why you shouldn't be treated like you're disposable. Let the silence work. Let it breathe. Let it build pressure in the places where your presence was once taken for granted. because if someone can't hear your value while you're near, they will feel the weight of your absence when you're gone. And maybe that's all the answer you ever needed. No message required. Florence was quieter than Aiden remembered. The last time he walked those cobbled streets, she had been beside him laughing, looping her fingers through his, whispering about the future, as if it were something solid they could touch. It wasn't. It never was. Now, the city felt like a memory wrapped in sunlight. The same cafes still stood. The Arno still shimmered beneath the Ponte Vecchio. But everything looked different, not because the place had changed, but because Aiden had. He came here for something no one could give him back. Not love, not closure, not even understanding. He came for space between who he had been in that relationship and who he was becoming now. There was no itinerary, no need to post, no appetite to be seen. Aiden moved through the streets like a man carrying something sacred inside him, something he wasn't going to waste explaining. And in the quiet of his absence from people's lives, things began to reveal themselves. Not just from her, but from everyone. Silence has a way of stripping away illusion. It removes the polite excuses and social masks. When you stop reacting, stop replying, stop engaging people, stop performing, that's when you see them clearly. Some of Aiden's old friends stopped reaching out altogether. Without the usual small talk, without his emotional availability, the thread between them quietly snapped. Not with drama, just gone. Others reached out awkwardly, as if testing his boundaries. Hey, haven't heard from you in a bit. Hope you're good. There was concern in those words, but also discomfort because Aiden's new silence disrupted their familiar pattern. They didn't know how to interact with someone who no longer played the role of overgiver. Fixer, explainer. And then there were those who got angry. You've changed, one message said. You're acting cold. Why are you so distant? But Aiden wasn't cold. He was clear. He didn't explain. He didn't defend. He didn't soften the edge of his new boundaries. Because for the first time, he wasn't interested in being misunderstood less. He was interested in being misunderstood less often. That meant not handing out emotional access to people who only valued him when he was convenient. He remembered something his grandfather once said when Aiden was a teenager. When people don't hear from you, they start to hear from themselves. And not everyone likes what they hear. That's what silence does. It holds up a mirror, and not everyone is ready to see their reflection. Florence became a sanctuary for reflection. Every morning, Aiden walked to the steps of Basilica di Santa Croce with a small journal and a black pen. He would sit in the same spot, watching tourists pass by, writing down everything he saw in people, especially the things they didn't say. He noticed how often people fill silence with performance, loud gestures, exaggerated stories, forced laughter. It was all noise designed to distract from what was real. But Aiden wasn't distracted anymore. He wrote a sentence one afternoon that stayed with him for days. When I stop explaining myself, people start revealing themselves. That was the truth. Silence didn't make him invisible. It made other people transparent. When you respond to everything, people can manipulate your reaction. They can spin stories, make themselves look like the victim, rewrite the narrative. But when you go quiet, truly quiet, they're forced to sit with their own version of the story. They can't redirect the blame. They can't provoke a response to justify their guilt. All they have left is themselves. And that silence. It's deafening for someone who thought they controlled how you felt. Aiden knew she might still be watching, checking his page, wondering why he hadn't tried again. Maybe she thought he didn't care anymore. Maybe she thought he'd moved on too fast. But the truth was simpler. He just wasn't available for emotional games anymore. He didn't need to correct the story she told herself about him. He didn't need to show up and set the record straight. He didn't need to prove he was kind, or good, or healing. He was healing, but in his own way, in his own silence, on his own terms. Before he left Florence, Aiden hiked up to Piazzale Michelangelo just before sunset. The city lay golden beneath him, the rooftops like old secrets, the sky a quiet fire. He took one last photo, not for posting, just for keeping, whispered something no one else would hear. This version of me doesn't chase clarity, he becomes it. Silence had changed him, not by hardening him, but by refining him. It showed him who belonged in his life and who only fit into the noise he was now done living in. And the best part? He didn't have to say a word. Kyoto greeted Aiden with a hush that felt almost sacred. Unlike New York's heavy hum or Florence's romantic murmur, this city didn't ask to be heard. It invited you to listen. He stood beneath the towering stalks of Arashiyama's bamboo grove, eyes closed, body still. The wind moved through the forest in rhythmic whispers, as if nature itself was trying to teach him how to breathe again. There were no texts here, no apps asking for attention, no past reaching for a second chance, just stillness. He hadn't come to Japan on impulse. This trip was intentional, not for distraction, but for deep, unfiltered quiet. He wanted to hear the things that had been drowned out by noise for too long, not the noise of the city, but the noise of his own mind. For weeks after the silence began, his head had been full of imaginary conversations, things he wished he'd said, rebuttals. 2 accusations that were never spoken, apologies he didn't owe. But in Kyoto, something shifted. As the world outside him went quiet, the world inside him began to speak. It didn't sound like clarity at first, it sounded like grief. He sat near the Katsura River one gray afternoon and wrote, "I'm not angry because they left. I'm angry because I stayed when it was already over." The truth hit like a confession, and once it was written down, more came. They didn't devalue me. I handed them my value, hoping they'd give it back. I don't need closure, I need peace. Each sentence felt like peeling off a layer of armor he never realized he was wearing. Because that's what truth is. It doesn't always arrive loud. It arrives slowly, after the noise has exhausted itself. And when it does, it doesn't ask for your permission to stay. Aiden remembered something Marcus Aurelius once wrote: "If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it." That line circled his thoughts like a mantra, because it wasn't the silence that had hurt him, it was his belief that silence meant worthlessness. But silence, he was learning, wasn't empty at all. It was a container, and when he stopped filling it with doubt, it filled itself with truth. For years, he'd been operating on a belief he hadn't questioned, that love, respect, even attention were things you earned. Perform well enough, love deeply enough, sacrifice freely enough, and you'd be chosen. But now, in this quiet, it became painfully clear. The only person he ever needed to be chosen by was himself. He thought about how often he'd waited for people to circle back. How much of his energy had been spent leaving emotional doors cracked open, just in case. But silence slammed those doors shut, and for the first time, he was thankful, not bitter, not proud, just relieved, because once the doors were shut, he didn't have to keep peeking through them. He could turn around and walk deeper into his own life. Each day in Kyoto became a quiet practice. He'd rise before dawn and walk through empty streets. No headphones, no podcasts. Just footsteps on stone and the sound of his breath. He journaled without editing, wrote poetry he'd never share, sat in temples long after the tourists had gone. He wasn't healing out loud. He wasn't proving he'd moved on. He was just returning to himself. The more silent he became, the clearer the separation grew between his emotions and his values. Emotion told him to call, to explain, to be heard. But value whispered, protect your peace, let it be, let them go. He understood. Now why the Stoics didn't make decisions in anger, why they paused before responding, why stillness was seen not as inactivity, but as power in the silence. Aiden wasn't trying to rebuild the past or rewrite what happened. He was building something entirely new, something from within. And the foundation was this: your worth is not determined by who listens when you speak, but by what you hear when you're alone. By the time he stood on the quiet balcony of his Kyoto Inn watching cherry blossoms fall like pink snow, he didn't feel healed, but he felt present, and that was enough. He whispered into the night. Not to her, not to anyone, but to the part of himself he had once ignored. You don't need to prove your pain to be allowed to feel it. You don't need to explain your boundaries to make them valid. You don't need to be loud to be understood. You just need to be still long enough to finally hear the truth. It was always there. It had always been waiting, but the world had to go quiet for him to finally hear it. When Aiden returned to New York, nothing had changed. Everything had. The apartment still looked the same. The buildings still rose like steel prayers. The subway still roared beneath the city like a restless undercurrent. But the way he moved through it all was different. He didn't walk faster. He walked quieter. He didn't speak less. He spoke with less need. There was a calm in him now that didn't demand to be noticed, but couldn't be ignored. For the first time in years, Aiden felt weightless, not because he had nothing to carry, but because he had stopped carrying things that didn't belong to him. People had started reaching out again. Of course they had. The same names that once vanished without explanation now reappeared with perfectly timed messages. Some came with small talk, others with nostalgia. One even said, "I miss the way you always understood me." But Aiden didn't respond. Not because he wanted to punish them, but because he finally understood something the old version of him never could. He didn't owe anyone an explanation for choosing peace. This was the kind of strength no one claps for, the kind no one posts about, the kind that lives in how you breathe, how you sleep, how you no longer flinch when someone withdraws. It's the strength of being unbothered. Confidence, he realized, isn't about proving you're good. It's about knowing you aren't, not needing a single person to agree. Before all this, Aiden used to try so hard to be understood. He wanted to be seen as thoughtful, forgiving, open-hearted. He thought explaining himself would clear things up, soften conflict, make people stay. But it never worked that way. Because people don't respect clarity that you have to beg for. They respect boundaries you don't explain twice. In Chicago, a friend named Naomi had once told him over coffee, "You don't rise by yelling louder. You rise by becoming quieter inside." At the time, it sounded poetic. Now, it felt like truth. Naomi was a doctor, brilliant, warm, dependable. She had spent most of her 20s being a people-pleaser in a lab coat, constantly making space for everyone else's emergencies. But something in her had cracked the day she realized she was showing up for people who wouldn't pick up the phone if she broke, so she stopped explaining her absence. She just became more selective with her presence, and people noticed. They called it cold. They called it different. What it really was sovereign. That's what Aiden was stepping into. Now, not a performance of confidence, but the embodiment of it. He didn't walk around with headphones anymore. He didn't rush through his days. He didn't need to post his boundaries to feel them. He just lived them. And people responded to that energy. Some with admiration, some with discomfort, some with silence of their own. But the difference was this: he wasn't shaken by it anymore. Because here's the thing most people don't understand. Confidence isn't loud. It doesn't enter the room needing applause. It doesn't argue to win. It doesn't tremble under judgment. It doesn't chase explanations. It doesn't perform healing for an audience. Real confidence is quiet because it no longer doubts itself. It knows what it brings. It knows what it deserves. And more importantly, it knows what it no longer accepts. Aiden had stopped justifying why he walked away. He stopped clarifying his boundaries. He stopped softening his truth for people who only ever loved the version of him that bent. That version was gone. And in its place stood someone rooted, grounded, not angry, just Finished. What made this new version of himself different wasn't that he had become someone else. It was that he had returned to who he was before he was taught to over-explain, over-apologize, and overextend. He walked through his neighborhood now, without looking over his shoulder for ghosts. He said no when he needed to, without wincing. He made space for joy without needing it to prove anything. And when people tried to re-enter his life with old energy, he simply didn't open the door. Not because he hated them, because he loved himself too much to let confusion back in. There was no bitterness in him, just boundaries, no need to be loud, just steady. And in that steady silence, Aiden found something he'd been chasing all along. Not the approval of others, but the quiet assurance that he didn't need it. He was no longer looking to be understood by the world. He was too busy being at peace with himself. Aiden stood on the summit of Mount Rigi, just as the first light of morning broke over the lake below. Lucerne shimmered beneath him like glass pulled tight across something ancient and still. The wind bit at his face, but he didn't flinch. He wasn't here for comfort. He was here for clarity. This was where it all came into focus, not in a moment of triumph, but in a quiet realization that required no applause, no witness, no closure. He had spent the last year learning how to stop chasing, how to stop begging, how to stop explaining himself to people who were never really listening. He had walked through silence in New York, reflection in Florence, stillness in Kyoto, but this was different. This was the moment he realized he didn't need anything back. Not the apology, not the explanation, not the message that says, "I finally understand." He didn't need to be remembered to know he had mattered. He didn't need to be missed to know he had given something real, because what he had found in the absence of all those things was himself. Detachment wasn't the numb, cold process he had once feared. It wasn't the death of feeling. It was the birth of freedom. He could still remember her voice, the weight of unspoken questions, the ache of unanswered texts, but they didn't hold power anymore. Not because they no longer existed, but because he no longer clung to them. That was the shift. Not forgetting, just letting go. He had always thought that letting go would mean losing people, losing memories, losing the version of himself that had loved so deeply, so openly. But he now saw it clearly. Letting go wasn't loss. It was alignment. It was choosing to stop bleeding for people who were never willing to offer a bandage. There had been a time when he confused attachment with apathy, when he believed that not caring was the only way to survive. But that was never what the Stoics meant. Detachment wasn't about building walls. It was about no longer abandoning yourself to scale someone else's. It was no longer needing to be needed. That kind of freedom doesn't come in an instant. It arrives slowly, like dawn on the mountain, first gray, then gold, then undeniable. Aiden sat on a rock near the edge, watching the light spill across the lake. The silence up here didn't feel empty. It felt earned. He thought about the people who had left, the ones who never explained, the ones who reached out too late, the ones who stayed, but only when he was soft, small, agreeable. He didn't hate them. He didn't want them back. But more importantly, he no longer wanted them to understand. That's where most people get stuck, in the desire to be understood by those who never really saw them. We rehearse speeches in our heads. We write unsent letters. We imagine conversations where the other person finally says, "You were right." But that's just another form of attachment, the final tether. And when you cut that, something sacred happens. You stop seeking justice in the past. You stop revisiting wounds to see if they still bleed. You stop hoping they'll grow enough to love you properly. You begin, finally, to live forward. Aiden stood, hands in his pockets, letting the mountain air fill his lungs. He didn't have to say anything to make this moment real. He didn't need to post it, explain it, or share it, because freedom doesn't need witnesses. It only needs honesty. he whispered one sentence into the wind. Not to anyone out there, but to the boy inside who had once needed so badly to be chosen. You're free now. And with that, he walked down the mountain, not faster, not slower, just lighter. Because detachment, he had learned, isn't the end of love. It's the beginning of self-respect. It's not walking away to prove a point. It's walking away because you've finally accepted that you don't need to argue for your worth anymore. It's not silence as punishment. It's silence as peace. And for Aiden, that peace was louder than any explanation he could have given. It echoed in every step he took, not away from someone else, but back toward himself. That's the freedom no one teaches you how to earn, but once you do, you never go back. It began with silence, but not the kind that brings peace, the kind that hurts, that slices through the chest like a dull blade, the kind that turns a read message into a wound. When Aiden was first left on read, it didn't feel like a breakup. It felt like being erased mid-sentence, forgotten without ceremony. He did what most people do when faced with absence. He filled it with noise. He tried to explain, justify, plead gently. He left the door open just in case, but no one came back through it, so he left instead, not with bitterness, not with fireworks, just with a decision. No more chasing, no more begging, no more explaining himself to those who had already chosen not to listen. What followed wasn't healing in the way the world romanticizes it. It wasn't tidy. It didn't happen with candles and soft music and motivational quotes. It happened through long walks, unanswered questions, moments of doubt, and difficult stillness. Aiden's journey took him from the noise of New York to the quiet streets of Florence, to the bamboo groves of Kyoto, and finally to the silence of Mount Rigi. With each step, he let go not of memories, but of the stories he had wrapped around them. Stories that said, if you were enough, they would have stayed. Stories that said, if you just explain better, they'll understand. But detachment taught him something else. It taught him that not everyone who exits your life deserves an invitation to return. That closure is not always given, but it can always be claimed. That peace is not the absence of pain, but the absence of self-abandonment. In his silence, Aiden found his boundaries. In his solitude, he found his strength. And in his stillness, he finally heard the voice he had been drowning out for years, his own. He didn't need them to understand. He didn't need them to regret. He didn't need them to say sorry. Because detachment, real detachment, isn't about getting over someone. It's about coming home to yourself. He learned that letting go doesn't mean you stop loving. It means you stop sacrificing your soul in the hope that someone else will recognize its value. He learned that closure doesn't require a conversation. Sometimes it requires silence. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all. That's the lesson Aiden took with him when he walked down that mountain. He didn't become someone harder. He became someone softer with himself, more honest, more anchored, more intentional with his time, his energy, his love. He was no longer interested in proving his worth. He was too busy living it. So what can we learn from Aiden's journey? We live in a world that trains us to react. When we're ghosted, we want answers. When we're hurt, we want justice. When we're misunderstood, we want to explain. But there's another way. The Stoics believed that true power comes not from what we control, but from knowing what we don't. You cannot control whether someone respects you, loves you, stays loyal to you, or sees your worth, but you can control what you tolerate. You can control what you return to. You can control how much of yourself you continue giving to people who treat you like an option. And that's where your freedom begins. It begins the moment you stop tying your peace to someone else's behavior. It begins the moment you stop arguing with reality. It begins when you walk away not to hurt them, but to heal you. Aiden didn't find peace because someone came back. He found peace because he stopped waiting. And you can do the same. If there's one truth to carry forward, it's this: you don't need closure, you need clarity. And sometimes, clarity only arrives when the noise stops and the silence is allowed to speak. So maybe it's time to stop filling the void with questions. Maybe it's time to stop rewriting the past. Maybe it's time to stop hoping they'll see what was always clear to you. Maybe it's time to let go, not because you're over it, but because you're finally ready to begin. Now I want to hear from you. What part of Aiden's journey resonated with you the most? Was it the silence, the detachment, the moment of clarity, or maybe something else entirely? Hey, I've been in Aiden's shoes. I know what that silence feels like. B, I'm still learning how to walk away without needing closure. Comment your answer below. A or B, and share your thoughts so others in this community can feel a little less alone in their healing. Let's build something honest together. And if this story moved you, if it gave you a moment of stillness in a noisy world, please take a second to subscribe to the channel. That small gesture gives us the fuel to keep creating deeper, more healing content like this. Until next time, protect your peace, and never forget your silence is not your weakness, it's your power.